Hello and welcome back to a YouTube video. Today I'm doing the patch 25.23 Midlane Tierlist server drop content. Like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch. Most notably, we saw nerfs towards the likes of Vladimir, mostly for top lane, where he received a pretty sizable nerf. It's like 700 AP you now need to break even on the QE spell, which is like the Rumble ult in his kit. It's very meaningful. It hurts his wave clear breakpoints. It hurts his just overall damage in team fights, so that definitely does mean something. Swain received a slight buff to his E. The mana cost went down. The damage, I believe, went up very slightly. I'll talk about Swain in a minute because Swain is also receiving follow-up changes in 25.24. Mel got adjusted. It was a push to try and make her passive more of her power budget, was taking away some of the power from the E. She is also getting follow-up work in 25.24, for mostly once again focused around nerfing down Emax and kind of encouraging Qmax as her main way to go again. Ari received a slight buff. This was a bit of a surprise. Ari's doing a lot better ever since her previous buffs, and yeah, the most recent buffs really did help her quite a bit. And Tristana received a slight buff towards her AD growth, mostly focused around on just helping Tristana bot lane. It's not bad, but it was not extraordinarily popular. This obviously is going to affect mid lane Tristana more, but she still underperforms quite heavily here. The only other change was an adjustment towards Fizz to try and help him out in some of his more polarizing matchups, was also trying to enable Fizz jungle as something which is viable. Let's get into it. So the detail is going to consist of the same 5 champions. That is your Varus, your Corki, your Tristana, Smolder, and Azir. None of these champions are particularly great at the moment. They have either specific scenarios where you can sometimes pick them, or they are just too reliant on certain conditions to be met. In the case of Azir, he's still like one of the best competitive mid laners in the game. He requires so much control and like just you want to be in a team environment so much to like get the full functionality out of his champion, and in the chaos of solo queue he just doesn't perform well. It's just a pick which I wouldn't really recommend at the moment, and his recent nerfs did once again put him into like the D tier for just solo queue is like not a recommendable option at the moment. Sporter has like specific matchups where you sometimes see him get played in. Obviously the one which comes to mind is the Yone matchup. I don't think the pick is horrible. He just demands so much to kind of be like relevant within the game, and I think that is some of the issues with just the other marksmen within the D tier. If you give them a lot of resources, they can function quite nicely as picks, but they've either been nerfed pretty heavily to make it so they aren't so good in mid lane, or they're generally just not in the best of states at the moment. I think like some Varus and Corki is generally just under the bar at the moment, but primarily because of like their competitive strength either recently or like previously. Citaven only consists of 4 champions. We have Gangplank, who akin to, I mean, I was going to say akin to Bizet, but not really. He just requires a lot of mechanical precision. Like, if you mess up on this champion, it's noticeable, and you will be considerably worse off than so many of the other mid laners at the moment. I also don't think Gangplank's in his greatest state in in the current game. Like, the rune options just aren't amazing. His itemization feels kind of so he's not a pick I truly recommend at the moment. I think if he got slightly buffed, he could definitely be a more promotable AD mid option. But for the moment, unless you're really comfortable on the champion, but like borderline OTP, if not just outright OTP, like then you're probably not going to be playing the pick. Obviously, Solar Backer is the only one which really comes to mind when it comes to Gangplank mid players. And yeah, I mean, it shows you what you can do with the pick, but you do have to be incredibly like skilled with it. The other picks within the C tier are just underperforming because of their like recent competitive stints. Things like Twisted Fate, Rise, and Telia have all been nerfed because of competitive. I don't like Twisted Fate that much at the moment. I think he just doesn't provide enough as a champion, whether that's through damage or just through the fact that you need to be so far ahead to kind of feel like you're able to do as much as some of the other mid laners. Obviously, as a counterpoint to that, you do have like your global like mobility, and you have the gold card, which is a very valuable pick tool. I think in more coordinated environments he definitely benefits, but in the case of solo queue, you're just not going to have that level of coordination which he really thrives in, and it's similar to the other 2 champions here. I don't think both these picks are as bad at the moment. Like, I think you can definitely make them work, and they're obviously still pretty solid in competitive, but unless you're like able to get high value out of their ultimates, you're relying more on just their overall DPS output, and that is going to be just lower unless you get a lot of gold, which then they can definitely function and like compete with some of the more like mainstream and more popular mid laners at the moment. But overall, I just don't recommend them as much for climbing solo queue at the moment, especially within like average ranks. I think they get better the higher up you go, so do keep that in mind when playing these champions. B-tier then, Annie's over nerfed. She was too strong and competitive. They nerfed her W and her baseline passive percentage, magic penetration, which really hurt her. It makes her a lot weaker in solo queue at the moment, so I just don't really recommend the pick as much in her current state. Aurora is also another champion which has kind of found herself in this competitive skew. It's unfortunate to see because obviously she is pretty popular. Well, I say she's actually not as popular anymore, but like she was kind of popular just for more casual audiences, so yeah, I mean, maybe they'll do something about that, maybe they won't, but right now she does underperform quite heavily for average brackets, like borderline like close to like the other C tier kind of like more competitively skewed champions. Gregos is alright. You're only really going to see him if he's played by an OTP. Outside of that, replacement probably doesn't matter that much. Alessandra, I think, is like a specific counter pick, can be fine, but she's just on the weak side at the moment. I think if she got slightly buffed, then she becomes a far more rewarding counter pick. Obviously into the things like LeBlanc is one of the more competitively normalized ones, but you can play her into most assassins and you really nullify a lot of what they want to do as champions. Twitch has definitely lost a lot of his popularity as a mid laner more recently. He had a slight stint of like AP Twitch with like PTA being quite popular, and it's not bad. I actually think it's like decent in some sports, but generally, yeah, he's unpopular again, and it's unfortunate to see. I have him in the B tier. I think it's a fine place to have him. If you're comfortable with the champion, you can definitely make him work at the moment. Jace, Yone, and honestly some of the other like AD assassins, they all have the issues where they are traditionally just going to be more elite skewed. The higher elo you are and better at piloting these picks, the more valuable they are. Things like like Jace, Yone, and then like some of your assassins are like really OTP, like high elo dependent usually, like your Kianas, your Talons, your Zeds, stuff like that. I think they can already thrive at the moment if you give them resources and you're really good at executing them. If you're not, then they just end up being far worse options, especially in like average brackets. Like I just wouldn't really recommend these picks until you are like, Master Plus and you've sunk a lot of time into them, so you really understand your limits and what you can kind of get away with these picks. I think Action also like fits into this kind of framework at the moment as well. And so some of your AP assassins also around here, like Katarina. I don't think she's bad, but she is also one of the most reliant on being OTP champions in the game. If you're not an OTP, then she is like so much worse, but she has such a large group of mains that it usually like inflates her win rate. So like whenever you have to look at statistics, you have to just be like aware of that. Like Katarina is just a very heavily mained champion, and LeBlanc with her recent nerfs has kind of also fallen into this category. I don't think she's like bad all of a sudden. In fact, I think she can still be really oppressive in the right spots, so especially if you're really comfortable with the champion, but she does like need that mastery, especially like within average brackets for the most part. Akali, I'd say, is the only one which I separate a bit more from this like heavily OTP'd framework. I think Akali is definitely one of the more broader assassins. Like you can play her into a decent chunk of things and she can be quite valuable. I also think she's got one of the lower barrier to entries out of the assassin pool, whilst also having a really high, especially when you can like master the champions. So I like recommending her on that aspect, but generally, yeah, they're all very similar in what they can do. It's just about how much time you have in them. Ziggs is alright. He's just slightly weaker than some of the other artillery options in the mid lane at the moment, which is why I have him within the B tier. I think if he was slightly better, then he probably competes with them a bit more and could probably be bumped up to the A tier. I don't think he's abhorrent. I think he's just fine. He's just there. He's just slightly weaker than some of his like counterparts. Silas, I think if you can get him in the right spots and you're really comfortable with the champion, he can be really oppressive. If you're not, then yeah, he's just not that great of a mid laner. In fact, he's far better jungle at the moment. Like if you're comfortable like playing Silas, you should probably just take him into the jungle if you want to play the role. Obviously, if you don't, then you just end up having to utilize him a bit more situationally when you are playing him in the mid lane. Cho'Gath, I dropped down. He's fine. Like he's just not as good as a mid lane option these days. Obviously also got buffed for jungle this patch, makes him, I'd say honestly, like pretty competitive as an option there, because you're doing relatively similar things. You're just running around the map, you're kind of like trying to burst people down so you can get feast stacks. If you can execute that well, then yeah, he's a pretty solid option. If you can't into certain compositions, then he ends up struggling and just falling flat quite a bit. So I think the B tier is a fine place to have him at the moment. Galio sits within the B tier. They nerfed him, and the nerf was relatively sizable. I actually was like surprised by just how much it ended up affecting him. It kind of pushes him back to just being a more specific counter pick in the current meta. If you can get him into AP matchups which have a hard time dealing with his like more oppressive kind of like overwhelming kit, then he can be quite strong, especially into like some of the assassins and even the mages. If you're able to kind of like live out the early game, he can do quite well into them. But generally, he's just a bit weaker at the moment, so I don't recommend him quite as much. Low barrier to entry though, and that's definitely going to be a selling point of the champion. Vladimir and Orianna wrap up the like remaining B2 options from the previous patch. In the case of Victor, he's being buffed next patch, and it's a sizable buff, so I imagine he will probably be bumped back up to the A tier, maybe even like a high A tier option. Definitely something to watch out for. The shield is going to be meaningfully stronger mid into late game, so yeah, just something to be cognitive of. In the case of Orianna, she's being shifted around a bit because of her competitive strength, and she's kind of landed as this like fine mid lane option for average queue. I don't think she's bad. I don't think she's also one of the best things to go to at the moment. I think there are either easier to pilot options or generally just slightly stronger options at the moment, which might not have quite the same level of barrier to entry as Orianna. I'm adding Tryndamere. He got a slight increase in player base. I think it was because of Rangers who was playing Halo Blades Tryndamere mid, and the recent buffs towards Halo Blades encouraged some people to play him, and he's doing fine. He's pretty solid as an AD option. I think if you put the time to him, he can easily compete with the the A tier AD options. Maybe he should even just be a low A tier option. I think he works quite nicely as a mid laner, especially if you're able to get the ball rolling, and he can do a lot of damage. Like he can be really overwhelming when ahead of the curve. The two picks which I'm dropping down are Vladimir and Wei. They go all the way from the S tier to the B tier. In the case of Vladimir, the nerf was pretty sizable. It hurts him in a lot of his AD matchups, like your Yasuos, your Yones, Tryndamere's, I guess, if you want to add that one in there. Yeah, he's meaningfully weaker in these, and that is going to hurt him quite a bit. The base health one doesn't matter quite as much, but even mages auto, so that armor base armor nerf is going to affect him in some of the mage matchups as well, especially the ones which want to like trade back autos in certain situations. And Hui, who is honestly towards the lower end of the B tier. I'm surprised this actually took quite as much away from him as it did. I mean, I think he's in the B tier. Maybe not like a low B tier option. I think he's just considerably weaker than he was in the previous patch. His wave clear is going to be affected. His overall ability to stall out games, and generally his ability to just do as much damage as he was in the previous patch, have all gone down. A tier then. So we lead off with actually three of the champions which were off this patch I've actually bumped up to the S tier. So we lead off with Zoe now. She's fine as an option. I think if you put the time to her, she can be really rewarding at the moment. If not, then she has a barrier to entry. She requires you to snowball her advantages early on into the game, and if you're not comfortable doing that, then yeah, she also does end up being weaker than other options around her. Also pretty elite skewed at the moment, so something to keep in mind when playing with champion. Aso, his recent buffs make him once again a promotable option. I think if you can get him in counterpick matchups which have a hard time dealing with him just freely stacking, he's great. He'll obviously suffer into assassins, makes sense. He is in a lot of situations, a stationary target, and that makes him very exploitable in some of those scenarios, so something to be aware of. I think as a counterpick he can be a great option again. In the case of Vex, also think as a counterpick, she is a great champion. I think she's generally underrated as a pick though. There are like haste variations of Vex which perform quite well, just like as numbers wise at the moment. And I think if you can exploit those in the right situations, yeah, generally she's a pretty solid pick at the moment. Fizz, the changes were pretty net neutral for mid lane. I believe he lost some haste on ulti, but in trade gained back some base armor, if I remember correctly, from the changes this patch, alongside like the jungle buffs. And yeah, he stays relatively neutral. I think he works really nicely into the mage matchup still, whilst being able to be a bit more durable in some of the AD matchups does help him. So yeah, stays within the A tier. Kassadin, also a really solid counterpick option. I think if you're comfortable with the champion and piloting him into some of the mages in the mid lane, then yeah, he's a solid pick. Not amazing, like just good. I'd say he's a good counterpick at the moment. Sion, a great Stonewall champion. I think if you can pilot him well, I mean, not even just pilot him well, like if you are able to just kind of enable your team to do what they want to do whilst being a nuisance in the mid lane, kind of stalling and just like providing your ultimate to side lanes whenever you can whilst being this like frontline option, he's good. he does end up being lower agency than other picks around him. You would know that. That's just is naturally how tanks function within the game. You are trading like some of your own individual agency for team agency, which can be a really valuable thing. But also, as a double-edged sword, can mean that you will lose games which you think you can just carry in a lot of situations. Malphite. Obviously, got the jungle buffs this patch, but generally, mid lane Malphite has been doing pretty well. Both the AP build into some of the mages and the tank build into some of your AD matchups work nicely. So, yeah, solid A tier champion at the moment. Zahen, I'm putting him in the A tier for the moment. He will probably, he will be dropped down, I imagine, next patch because of the buffs, because of the nerfs, rather. He is doing really well at the moment. He is probably still overpowered even with the recent hotfix nerfs to him. In the top lane, I still have him, I think, high in, and like probably in the S tier even. In mid lane, he looks to be slightly weaker, probably sits as more like an A tier option at the moment, with the nerfs, so definitely worth like coming back and observing like where he has dropped to, as like people figure out the builds and like how to like play the champion. Aurelia, Yasuo, Garen are some of your AD options within the mid lane. In the case of Aurelia, she is absurdly elite. Well, I mean, not even just elite skewed. You just have to be so like do so much early on into the game, and if you can do that, then she's a great option. If you struggle pushing early advantages, then she ends up being a really bad pick. So do keep that in mind when playing Aurelia. Like if you're comfortable with the champion and you're comfortable taking over games, then she is a great pick for you. If you're not, then she ends up being a really bad option. You should probably just pick some of the other AD picks around her. Unfortunately, saying that, Yasuo is relatively similar. Like you need to get ahead early on to the game. Utilize his oppressive mobility and his like general baseline damage, and you can do a lot. If you're not comfortable with that, then he ends up being a lot weaker. I think Garen's the better just scaling option. Like if you are just looking for a bruisery juggernaut. I mean, juggernaut is kind of fake when talking about Garen. He is more of just like a bruiser skirmisher, honestly, because you are playing like Shybreaker into usually PD and Mortal Reminder or Shojin. There are other builds like floating around at the moment, and generally, yeah, I'd say he sits in the A tier. You can definitely make him work. Not one of the mainstream AD mid laners, but definitely something which can function here. Some of your more niche options include the likes of Heimerdinger and Nico, where I think if you're comfortable on these champions, they can do quite a bit within the game, but they are very unpopular in the mid lane at the moment. They are some of the least popular mages. Nico has had a couple of like general nerfs towards her, like kind of bullshitty interactions, which if you're aware of, then they were really exploitable and were a lot of her power budget, I think, especially in higher brackets. But if you're just like a more general player and you just utilize her oppressive early game with her like really potent W spell, I think she can still be a really good option. Heimerdinger is just about understanding turret placement and how to like really maximize the value out of like the damage his champion can provide. Morgana, Brand, Malzahar, Veigar, they all kind of sit in the same bracket of like, these are better for like average bracket champions. They perform a lot better in average elos. Do I recommend them as much for general climbing into higher brackets? No, that's just by nature of the picks. They are exploitable the higher up you go, and they kind of rely on your opponent just not really understanding the like nature of the champion and how to kind of pressure it. They are all champions which kind of trivialize certain aspects of the game. In the case of like Brand, Malzahar and Morgana, it's wave clear. You don't really need to think about it. You kind of just dump yourselves into the wave and it will naturally like just clear it. In the case of Veigar, it's more just the fact that he scales so well, and being able to kind of scale it into a game is going to be innately low elo skewed because you are, I mean, just on average for games that are just going longer. The other picks in the A tier include the likes of Lux, Zeref, and Vel'Koz. In the case of all three of these, they are kind of like your artillery options. They do what they kind of do what it says on the tin. Vel'Koz traditionally is a bit better, just like baseline values, as it does require, I'd say, a bit more AP to kind of like do what he wants to do, but it's also probably a bit better in mid lane than Vel'Koz, which is a bit better in support. Lux, I think, generally just trivializes wave clear. You can just ER the wave, and you can kind of utilize that to do other things on the map, but she is also the most dependent on getting gold out of the three. If you fall behind, you'll feel it. You won't do the burst damage you need to kind of be relevant within the game or be like this big threat. So yes, then, I am bumping up Swain, I am bumping up Mel, and I am bumping up Ari. Okay, I'll talk about Mel first. Mel is obviously the big talking point at the moment. She is incredibly frustrating. She is eating so much ban rate, and Riot have noticed they are nerfing her in 25.24. You should still max E this patch. That is very clear. People are still maxing Q even with like the changes. They are once again taking a swing at it next patch, and yeah, she gained from it this patch because most people still max Q, and even though the gap is definitely closed, it's still there. Like if you're maxing E, she is still like I mean, she's probably the best mid laner in the game at the moment. So do keep that in mind. But for the moment, I'm just going to push her up to the S tier because she is very clearly strong in her current state. Ahri, the buff this patch was nice. It did a decent chunk for her. It was a buff towards her W. It helps her trading. It helps her wave clear. And that is meaningful. So I've bumped her up to the S tier. In case of Swain, he is getting a massive buff next patch. Swain is probably going to be the best counter pick in the game next patch if those buffs go live. Even now, he's an incredible counter pick into those low damage, like shorter range compositions. He really thrives as a pick. Can you blind him this patch? No. Can you blind him next patch? Probably not. But he will be more blindable. I mean, I say more blindable. He will be better in some of those situations because the general sustain will go up on the champion. It's a buff towards his like passive. It's going from 3 to 6 to 6% flat, which is really going to help his early game. Especially top lane. I think this will do most for top lane Swain. But yeah, mid lane Swain doing really well at the moment. Will continue to do well and do even better next patch with those buffs if they go live. So the other picks on the S tier are all like ones from the previous patch. The likes of Quinn, Pantheon, Neferi make up my like AD S tier options. I think Neferi is a really slept on champion, and honestly so is Pantheon. I think Pantheon mid lane is his best role at the moment. Quinn is pretty understood as being a very solid mid lane option. Her general kit just works so well in solo queue, which is why these three picks work really nicely as like an AD, as like the AD options within the S tier. The AP options include the likes of Kennen, who is a niche option, but really, really powerful in mid lane, especially in the current meta where it's all about team fighting, and you can just rock up to a fight, press R, and that's usually what you need to do within the game. Your AP assassins include the likes of Echo and Diana. Both are really performant at the moment in the mid lane, and have been for a while. Especially in the case of Diana, she has a really oppressive laning phase, being able to do so much damage with like the Q sweeps of the on the pick. In the case of Echo, it's more about these like roaming to sides and just getting these like multi-man W's, and then being able to just output your like burst combo, and then being able to just move back to mid lane, and your wave clear is pretty nice on the champion as well. So there's just a lot of strength to it, combined with like your early oppressiveness with like E-Halo Blades as well. There is a lot to say about this champion. Some of the other options include the likes of Kayle, who's probably my premier recommendation for like a scaling option. In mid lane, she's just so unassailable. You will almost always reach the point where you're going to be valuable within the game with very little resistance, if anything. So it really makes her quite an easy pick to sell within the S tier. In the case of Cassiopeia and Anivia, they received recent buffs, which was honestly surprising. They were both doing fine in the previous patch, but Riot seemed to like maintaining these picks as like solid S tier options. Obviously, Anivia saw play at Worlds this year, great to see, and honestly so did Cassiopeia. So yeah, both of them really solid in that regard. Great in like counter pick scenarios into like those more mobile compositions, or even into some mobile competitions which just don't really have tools to deal with, in this case like Cassiopeia's W and Anivia's W. And with Syndra is probably my number one pick at the moment. I just really like Syndra as a pick. She is generally going to have value in almost every game she's played. She is a really broad option as well. Loads of people play her. You have lots of resources to learn from the champion, and yeah, it makes her a very promotable option. I think like my top two picks this patch are for sure Mel and Syndra. Mel, if you max E, then yeah, she's probably the premier option, but Syndra just generally also really good at the moment. So yeah, those two picks really like make up the top of the S tier, and those are my thoughts. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.